There can also technically be non-power of 2 bottom numbers, but those are cringe and we're not going to talk about it. Alright, fine, we'll talk about it. Before we talk about irrational time signatures, we should probably first address the related concept of metric modulation. And to understand metric modulation, we must first understand what modulation is in the context of key changes. Modulation simply refers to the process by which we change keys. If we're in the key of C major and we want to go to the key of D flat major, we have a few options. We can have a clean split between the part that is clearly in C major and the part that is in D flat. This is called a direct modulation. Alternatively, we can have a kind of gradient between the two keys, where a chord or series of chords has at least vague function in both keys, leading to a smooth transition to our new key. This is called a pivot modulation. There's a few other types, but for our purposes, that's really all we need to think about. Metric modulation is exactly what it sounds like, modulation but for our meter instead of our key. We're changing the way we feel an already established beat at a given tempo. Technically speaking, if anything about the meter or groove changes, like the tempo, feel, or time signature, it's metric modulation, because the meter modulates. But in common practice, things that are called metric modulation follow 2 rules. Rule 1 is that there must be some sort of mathematical relationship, a clean ratio between the 2 meters. Our ear has to hear the relationship between the 2 groups. Going from a 4/4 groove at 97 BPM to 4/4 at 163 will just sound like we're getting faster indiscriminately, and as such isn't commonly considered to be metric modulation. But going from 4/4 at 90 BPM to 4/4 at, say, 120 BPM could be considered metric modulation, since there is a discernible 3:4 ratio between the 2 tempos. This ratio allows note values to have relationships and intermingle between the 2 meters. As such, rule number 2 is that almost always, at least our cleanest metric modulations will be a pivot modulation of sorts. There will be some rhythm within the groove that has clear function in both meters, but still takes up the same time duration. Perhaps the simplest and kindest metric modulations are the types where the perceived beat changes, but the pivot rhythm remains the same note value. Take a listen to the title track from Metroid, especially what the drums are doing. The 8th note remains the same speed between the 2 meters. If I just tap our 8th notes between the 2 tempos and time signature changes, it sounds like nothing happens. However, consider that in 4/4 we feel the beat as the quarter note. In 6/8 we actually typically feel the beat as the dotted quarter note, each measure composed of 2 beats containing 3 8th notes per. What this means is that even though the 8th note stays the same, by nature of 6/8 having 3 8th notes per beat instead of only 2, it feels like the beat actually gets slower. Let's take a listen to the metric modulation again, but this time I'll add clicks for how we're perceiving the beat. Really elegant in how simple the metric modulation is, but it still kind of catches you off guard. Perhaps the name Metroid was always a subtle reference to metric mod. We can hear another example of this exact same thing in Undertale's Fallen Down reprise. Same thing, our eighth note is the same speed in both grooves, but the beat sounds like it's slowing down in the 6/8 section. In case you're wondering how I'm calculating these tempos, it's actually pretty simple. The first section is at 110 quarter notes per minute, which means it's at 220 eighth notes per minute. If the eighth note remains the same and the dotted quarter note contains 3 eighth notes, we divide 220 by 3, giving us 73.333 dotted quarter notes per minute, or a 3:2 ratio between our two tempos. You might also notice 3/4 and 6/8 do in fact take up the same amount of time. After all, each contains 6 eighth notes. But I would argue this is still metric modulation, albeit at its simplest. The perceived beat changes in a clean ratio. The meter do be modulating. But there is a much more common style of metric modulation, the opposite of what we've just looked at. In these examples, the pivot rhythm will look different in both meters, but the beat will look the same. We can go from something like 4/4 to 4/4, speeding up or slowing down with the pivot rhythm functioning as two different things between the two meters. A great example of this is in Bjöörn's I Still Miss You. The time signature does not change. We stay in 4/4 but speed up in a 3:4 ratio. As such, what previously sounded like our eighth note now sounds like our quarter note triplet. We can see the pivot rhythm as the eighth notes in the I Still Miss You, which becomes the quarter note triplets in the bass. The vocal chop quarter notes, meanwhile, sound much faster than the quarter notes in the previous section. Another example of this kind of thing can be heard in Pandora Paradox, a tune from the arcade rhythm game My Finale. We go from 3/4 to 4/4 after the intro section, which doesn't matter much because the quarter note keeps the beat in both. But we metric mod in a 3:4 ratio. This beeping metronome instrument plays quadruplets, 4 even notes in the span of 3 quarter notes. One of those quadruplets becomes our new quarter note. But we actually metrically modulate a second time only a few moments later. This measure gives us eighth note triplets, setting up our 2 to 3 metric mod into this new section. We haven't really talked about it yet, but what's the point of metric modulation in the first place? It takes some math and you have to really finesse the rhythms to make it work. I would say in the earlier examples it gives a nice division between the sections. Sure, they could have slowed down or sped up the tempo to whatever number they wanted, but that smooth metric mod is kind of interesting and adds a fun layer of rhythmic ambiguity when it happens. On top of these reasons, the metric mod in this song has kind of a meta purpose. This is in a rhythm game, of course, and these weird perceived tempo changes add a level of difficulty that trips you up in a fun, mathy kind of way that you can't achieve with just normal time sig changes. Here's a fun one, a Dark Zone from Deltarune Chapter 4. Kind of a unique metric modulation happens here. Typically, the pivot rhythm is a subdivision of our beat, but here the pivot is actually the dotted half note, which takes up the exact same duration as the whole note of the new tempo, giving us a 3:4 ratio. It's definitely a bit harder to hear. Since the chords are rather long, and also since the pulse is faster than our pivot, it kind of distracts. It does bring up an interesting point though. Is this metric modulation if the ratio isn't immediately apparent and if the pivot rhythm is longer than our beat? I would argue yes, but it's definitely a weaker example of metric mod. It's more akin to a direct modulation than a pivot modulation, where we don't have an immediately clear pivot just modulating once we get to the new section. But it does still fulfill that 3:4 ratio with the tempos, and you can kind of hear that. I am interested in why Gaster would make Kara make Tricky Tony do this. This is the battle theme of Jackenstein. During this fight, you slowly navigate a house and grab a key, after which he famously declares his iconic catchphrase. Before chasing you, your movement speed also increasing. This sudden increase in speed mirrors exactly what happens in the song.
You can't keep getting away with it!
Another metric modulation of dubious validity can be found in the Ravio shop theme from A Link Between Worlds. We have this short little section where we go to a faster 6/4, using the eighth note triplets to pivot in a 2:3 ratio. And then we use the quadruplets to snap back to our original meter in a 3:2 ratio, kind of reversing the metric mod. Since the 6/4 at this tempo takes up the exact same duration as a 4/4 measure in the old tempo, you could really just notate it like this, just funny triplets instead of metric mod. This makes a lot of sense too, considering that we go right back to the original feel only a few measures later, the bassoon line even starting to pivot a measure before. But I consider this to still be metric mod because there's just so much effort to make it feel like 6/4, with each quarter note divided into eighth notes versus just simple triplets. Perhaps it's more apt to think of it as metric tonicization. In terms of key changes, I best liken modulation versus tonicization to a swimming pool analogy. We can think about two different key centers as a swimming pool and the dry land surrounding it. Modulation is when you jump into the pool, you fully commit to a key change, and if you want to go back to your original key, you have to make your way back with effort. Tonicization, meanwhile, is simply dipping your legs into the pool. You tease a new key center and can fully modulate, but there's no expectation. You can just as easily get out and walk away. Bringing this metaphor back to metric tonicization, here we tease this metric modulation, but it's neither at a strong sectional break, nor does it strongly commit to the new meter for long enough. We tonicize, so to speak, the 6/4 at 198 briefly, but quickly gradient back to our old feel. And it really keeps you on your toes, perfect for this quirky shop theme for an equally quirky shopkeeper. This next tune has kind of a funny backstory. So back at Berkeley, I was writing music for a game jam with my friend, and he was handling the general traversal theme. I remember metric mod being this big hilarious concept at Berkeley, so it was always some ridiculous contest to see how often you could insert it into tracks. Anyways, he wrote this track for the game. I don't think the lead developer appreciated the metric mod at all. But it's hilarious and kind of a banger I still think about 7 years later. And more importantly, a really, really good example of textbook metric mod. This section sounds super wacky, but is conceptually rather straightforward. We more or less play the melody verbatim 4 times in a row, but the drums and sometimes bass metrically modulate us into each repetition. It's very textbook, there's no ambiguity because we stay in 4/4 the entire time. The consistent melody helps ground us in the new feel, and we always have a pivot rhythm before the modulation. Perhaps there's a bit of an argument for metric tonicization, especially with it changing so quickly and frequently, but I would argue it's strong enough that it feels like it could settle into the new feel at any point. Hilarious tune, and thank you Bjorn for letting me use this. Which leaves us with the final tune I want to talk about in the metric modulation half of the video. Previously, we've only talked about tunes with ratios of 2s, 3s, and 4s, mostly because our pivot rhythms were duplets, triplets, and quadruplets. But what about a tune with a metric modulation ratio of 4 to 5? First, let's take a listen to the intro. We're in a pretty believable 4/4, but every quarter note, rather than being subdivided into 4 16th notes or even 3 triplets, is instead divided into 5 quintuplets. And the tune stays in this quintuplet grid for the majority of it. But if that wasn't enough, we also get a metric modulation later in that aforementioned 4:5 ratio. Let's take a listen. So crazy. So what we're doing is turning 4 of the 5 notes of the quintuplet into our new 4 16th notes, or alternatively 1 quarter note, 4/5 of a quarter note to our new quarter note. What's even crazier though is that the other instruments are still adhering to the old grid, sometimes. Since 5/4 at this new tempo is equivalent to the 4/4 at the old tempo, the bass and kick drum dividing the measure evenly into 4 hits sounds like 4 quarter notes in the old groove. The result is this 5/4 polyrhythm going on, but only in some measures, 2 meters happening at the same time. Crazy stuff. Okay, so that's all of the metric mod tunes I've been meaning to talk about for years now, so let's finally address irrational time signatures and how they relate to metric mod. As a quick refresher for time 6, the top number refers to how many of the bottom number we have per measure. So for instance, a song in 4/4 means we have 4 quarter notes per measure, 7/8 means we have 7 eighth notes, 31/16 means we have 31 16th notes, and so on and so forth. Almost certainly, every time signature you've ever seen in your entire life has a lower number of 1, 2, 4, 8, 16, maybe even 32 or 64. Powers of 2, which makes a lot of sense. The bottom number refers to how we're dividing the whole note. A time signature with a bottom number of 1 means we're counting whole notes, 2 means we're counting half notes, 4 for quarter notes, and etc. A so-called irrational time signature is a time signature with a lower number that isn't a power of 2, things like 3, 5, 7, or 10. I do want to mention how I think the term irrational time signature is a bit confusing at best and a misnomer at worst, since the lower numbers are in fact rational in a mathematical sense. It also helps to distinguish these from true irrational time signatures with an irrational lower number like pi or e or something, which you know about the 11 over Euler's constant time signature. I think it makes a lot of sense to refer to non-power of 2 lower number time signatures as non-dyadic, dyadic referring to our usual power of 2. So what would something like 4/3 even look like? Lower number of 3 means we're dividing the whole note into triplets. Upper number of 4 means we have 4 of those little guys per measure. But what is the point of this? If I wrote an entire song in 4/3, are we really going to hear the beat as 4 triplet divisions of the whole note? Almost certainly not. We're probably just going to hear it as 4/4, because we simply have no information that tells us that we're hearing 4 triplet divisions of the whole note. The much more obvious explanation that our ears will latch onto is that we're just hearing 4 quarter notes per measure. It's important to consider that this kind of use case, where the time signature is non-dyadic for the entire tune, is both unclear for musicians to read and almost always unjustifiable as a transcription of something. There is really only one justifiable application of non-dyadic time signatures that I'm aware of, and that is as a relative time signature. When we've already established a dyadic time signature, we can use the relativity to that time signature to establish our non-dyadic one, which of course is something we can do in tunes with metric modulation, where the 2 tempos are also in a kind ratio. Non-dyadic time signatures allow us to notate the ratio between the 2 grooves using the bottom number, rather than with tempo. Though you can technically do this, there's still that problem of clarity. Unless you're some sick freak who'd rather read the rest of a tune as 4/6 instead of 4/4, it almost always makes more sense to just write the new tempo, and maybe to illustrate the metric mod, include the metric mod ratio next to it, as I've been doing. But I think this clarity problem only exists for tunes where we fully modulate. What about metric tonicizations, where we just have a few bars of a new meter? Or even smaller one-measure metric tonicizations in the middle of a groove? I'm not even sure you could call that metric tonicization, maybe metric interchange or something? But either way, that would pretty much be the only justifiable instance of non-dyadic time signatures in notation that I can think of. These instances where it would get really messy to notate a new tempo for just 1 or 2 bars, just to go back to the old one, especially if that pattern repeats. You don't even really need to pivot into it, so long as the math checks out with the division of the whole note. So let's take a look at some examples of non-dyadic time signatures in video games.
Where is it?
Yeah, I couldn't find anything. But hold on a sec. Perhaps non-dyadic time signatures in the context of metric tonicization are simply too weird and counterintuitive to exist in your favorite mainstream Nintendo games. But what if it was common? I've mocked up some examples of your favorite video game soundtracks from a kinder, less dyadic universe. Pretty trippy. Like what I was saying about the metric modulation earlier, it really is this layer of rhythmic complexity that you can't achieve with something like mixed meter or even polyrhythms to some extent, having this pulse that changes speeds. I think it's really hard to have something that's palatable and accessible while also being a justifiable case of non-dyadic time sigs. So if you guys have any cool examples, video games or otherwise, please let me know in the comments. If you liked this video, smash that subscribe button, hit that bell, and consider supporting me on Patreon. Before the video's over, I would be remiss to not at least give a passing mention to true irrational time signatures. Let's see if I can whip something up in MuseScore.
For me, impossible.